Take 3.
Ready, and 3, 2.
Suzanne Bigelow is with me, and we're talking about mindfulness and where it's come from and where it's going. And Suzanne, I want to get into the field that we cross over, the field that I study, which is the neuroscience of aging. And your expertise crossed paths only in the last 10 to 15, maybe 20 years, but let's say about the last decade.
Yep.
We now have the technology to actually see what's going on. And go back to the Chinese and the Indian cultures, they knew it worked. They knew what you're doing worked, but the science world, the Western world, was not going to buy that. You can't prove that. Well, now we're in a different era. So what do you see happening, and how does it affect people being attracted to something that's so supported by neuroscience?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I first got into this field, and especially in corporate mindfulness, I would get this, you do what kind of a look? But it has just really exploded. And I have to tip my hat to Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn, who kicked off most of the research as an epidemiologist. He studied the effects of meditation on clinical populations and developed the mindfulness-based stress reduction
And that
product.
time he was almost alone in the field
Yep.
of trying to figure out how to prove something. How does it really work? So decades and decades of work, all of a sudden it's sudden fame. And what's that saying? Instant success takes about 7 years.
Yeah.
And suddenly, about a decade ago, he's on the scene with what he'd been working on for decades. And what at one point you talked to me about the woo-woo effect, and go into why is that a hurdle that's now being jumped over?
Well, because these traditions come from contemplative lineages, Buddhist or Hindu, there has been a lot of baggage that comes with that, philosophical baggage. And that's what was beautiful about Jon Kabat-Zinn's work. As a physician, he knew personally this stuff worked. He started saying, okay, let's take the best of what I like from my Buddhist practice and create this 8-week training and run it on clinical populations, because I know it works.
And he's based in Boston with MIT and Harvard and Mass General.
University of Massachusetts
right.
Center for, yes, you're going to have to edit that one out because I don't remember the whole name of it.
No, what you've shown.
Google it.
No, what you've shown is that as the brain is trying to get to the next step, sometimes you can't remember. It'll come to you in about 3 minutes.
Well, and the fact of the matter is there is so much information now coming out about what's going on with mindfulness. I really, I can't contain it all. Because what happens is there was enough clinical research to keep things going with these targeted populations. But then when the functional magnetic resonanceing came along
The
and
fMRI.
could show us what was going on inside the brain, that's when things really started taking off.
Right, we have a family, in fact, of generations now of images that can see inside our brains in real time and figure out, does mindfulness training work? Does it change the actual physical structure? Now, no time in history had that ever happened, and Kabat-Zinn wasn't looking to try to break ground to show it. He knew it worked. But when the fMRI, the PET scan, the MEG scan, and all of the imaging machines came in, what happened to the field?
Well, the biggest groundbreaking work was actually done in concert with the Dalai Lama, who said, I want to understand what's going on scientifically when we do this loving kindness practice that is part of their tradition. And he teamed up with Richie Davidson and the University of Wisconsin, and I want to say Rick Hansen was also part of that kind of groundbreaking neuroscientist that did some extensive research on the brains of 3 different populations. The first population was the rock stars of meditation, these Tibetan monks out of the Dalai Lama's lineage. And then they took the same fMRI images of people that had never meditated before ever and people that had just finished an 8-week mindfulness training. And what they saw in the scans of the Tibetan monks was the place in the brain that is associated with thinking around loving kindness, calm, contentment, compassion, was actually thicker in those rock star physically thicker. The gray matter in the left prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain where those thoughts occur, was like they've been doing bicep curls.
Now let's back up. How do we know that that's where those thoughts occur? And we know that what they did was to tell them, they can hear in an fMRI, and they told them, please now think of something compassionate and think of the loving kindness. So they determined where it happened.
You could see the brain light up.
And in the other two cohorts, they also asked them in the same place in the brain. That's why brain mapping for a study like Davidson did becomes something that is not only objective, but it's solid as a rock to move to other levels. Keep going.
Well, solid as a rock is right. And what was cool is it was proof positive that if you change brain activity, you actually change brain function and you change brain composition. That means that the thoughts that you practice are actually changing your brain. That's the neuroplasticity that we talk about. Your brain learns from current experience. And what's interesting about that in the business world, for example, that current experience is one of multitasking, high distraction, information overload, always on, and the brain begins to train itself that that's the auto default. Along with the brain's own tendency to wander, the combination is just...
But it doesn't happen just in a couple of days. It happens in a short period, relatively short period of time. But the beauty of what Davidson did was to show that when you had those experienced masters of meditation that had been doing that for decades, they had that part of the brain that could be, was so strong that it's a goal to get that part of the brain improved. So it's use it and improve it.
Well, and that's what was cool about the people that had just finished that 8-week training. They had already changed their brains.
Compared to the
people that had not done any training at all. So we are inadvertently training our brains for that multitasking distraction thing for our entire lives. But what's cool is in 8 weeks, you can begin to develop a new default and a new neural set of pathways that are more associated with calm, contentment, compassion. And the study and the research around compassion is what you're going to hear a lot about in the next year.
That's right. And that study was about a decade ago from Wisconsin.
Yep.
And since that time, there's an annual get-together between the we'll call them the neuroscientists of the Eastern world and the neuroscientists of the Western world. So the machinery meets the Dalai Lama and his master meditators, and they're coming up with new ideas on how to give you tools in your profession to be able to actually make a difference, not in a decade, but right away.
Well, and this is what's been most exciting is we understand that you don't need to go sit in a dark cave for a decade to get benefit from this practice. You can do it in micro practices throughout your day. Once you establish that mind-body connection and learn to step back, the more you practice that, the more that becomes your default. But you can do it as a part of your commuting to work, so as a part of your waiting for your shift to start.
That's wonderful. So it's almost like a spiral that just keeps getting better as long as you continue to maintain it. And we're going to talk about some of those ideas that you've got in a bit. Let's stop now for another brain break, and then we'll come back and add some more layers to this.
Thank you.